Welcome to the deep dive. We dig into sources to pull out the key stuff for you.
That's the idea.
Okay, so today we're diving into Sam Vaknin and his perspective on romantic relationships with individuals who have borderline personality disorder, BPD.
Right, Vaknin. He's a clinical psychology professor known for his work on personality disorders, especially narcissistic personality disorder, NPD, and how it links up with BPD.
Yeah, his book, Malignant Self-Love, is pretty well known in the field.
Definitely.
So our mission today, it's to really get Vaknin's expert view. And yeah, sometimes his views are a bit unconventional on the challenges, the potential outcomes of these relationships. We want to give you some clear takeaways.
Okay, so where do we start? Well, one of the first striking things in Vaknin's analysis is how he frames these relationships. He talks about them being almost psychologically contagious.
Contagious, that's a strong word.
It is. He suggests it's not just that the relationship is difficult, but that the BPD partner's internal dynamics can actually sort of seep into and infect the other partner's mind.
Wow. Okay, so he really takes it quite far. He even suggests the partner might, temporarily become a kind of mix of narcissist and borderline.
Exactly. That's his argument. And the result he describes for the non-BPD partner, even if they started out pretty grounded and healthy, it can be severe psychological deterioration.
So it's not just about feeling stressed or unhappy, it's deeper.
Yeah, Vaknin argues it can be a fundamental shift. He talks about the partner developing strong narcissistic defenses, even adopting a narcissist's way of relating to reality, things they wouldn't have done before.
It sounds like he sees the relationship itself as the core problem for the partner's mental state.
Pretty much. He makes this point quite strongly, actually. He says that walking away from the borderline usually restores health, mental health.
Just like that.
Well, maybe not just like that, but he implies a direct causal link. He compares the whole experience to a devastating emotional car crash.
Okay, so the big takeaway right at the start is Vaknin sees these relationships as potentially altering the partner's psychological state quite significantly.
Right, which leads to the question, why? What's driving this contagion, as he calls it?
And that brings us to his ideas about the internal world of someone with BPD, doesn't it?
It does. He focuses on this idea, internal emptiness, and something he calls the bad object.
The bad object. Let's unpack that a bit. Is it just low self-esteem?
It's more fundamental than that, in Vaknin's view. It's like this core belief of being inherently flawed or bad, and it becomes their main sense of identity. He says they feel they can't give up on her bad object because it's the only real internalized thing they have.
Even though it's negative?
Yeah, it provides a kind of consistency, even if it's a negative one. And Vaknin links this back to early development.
Okay.
He sees it as a disruption in identity formation, basically a failure to fully separate and individuate, often from the mother figure, so they don't develop a solid, independent sense of self.
Which would explain why he says they tend to replace their core identity with whoever's eyes they're seeing themselves through. It's like they borrow their sense of self from others.
Precisely. And that internal void. He suggests they might try to fill it with various things, including what he terms chronic addictions, and that can even include people, using relationships to fill the emptiness.
Okay, so the key insight there is this deep-seated identity instability.
Yeah, and this instability often manifests externally. Vaknin points to persistent hostility, anger, irritability, often triggered by what seem like minor slights.
All right, now here's a part that seems really counterintuitive based on what Vaknin says. This paradox about love.
Ah, yes. He says, the more you offer true and unconditional love and intimacy, the more you're pushing her away.
Which goes against everything we usually think helps relationships, right? More love should be good.
Exactly. But if you connect it back to that bad object idea, Vaknin suggests genuine love actually creates a conflict. If the core belief is, I am bad, then someone loving you unconditionally feels wrong. It feels like a threat to that established internal reality.
So the very thing you think would help real love and acceptance actually makes them uncomfortable or anxious.
That's the idea. It challenges their core negative self-perception. So the takeaway is that standard approaches, like showering someone with love, might actually backfire in this specific dynamic, according to him.
And to sort of resolve that conflict, Vaknin suggests they might act out, behave badly.
Yes, to essentially prove the partner wrong, to show them, see, I told you I was bad, you were naive to think otherwise. It reinforces the bad object and brings back that internal consistency.
Wow. That's a really challenging dynamic to grasp.
It absolutely is. And it leads into another key concept he discusses, the approach avoidance repetition compulsion.
Approach avoidance. So like, come here, go away.
Pretty much, yeah. A constant push and pull. Partners are drawn in, then pushed away, then maybe drawn back in again. It's this perpetual cycle.
That sounds incredibly destabilizing. You never know where you stand.
Exactly. And that makes feeling secure almost impossible. The key insight is this push-pull dynamic prevents any real stability.
And Vaknin argues this directly impacts boundaries, right?
Massively. He says this dynamic makes it impossible to negotiate borders or to maintain boundaries effectively within the relationship.
Why impossible?
Because the boundaries themselves are constantly shifting. One minute they might be rigid and exaggerated, paranoid and aggressive. The next they're mushy and fuzzy and permeable and, to all intents and purposes, non-existent.
So there's no consistency in how closeness or distance is managed.
Right. And he links this instability to what he calls twin contradictory anxieties.
Which are?
The fear of abandonment, separation, insecurity, and at the same time, the fear of being smothered or losing themselves, engulfment anxiety.
So they fear being left alone, but they also fear getting too close. That sounds like a constant state of tension.
It is. And Vaknin says this results in a pervasive lack of safety, a sense of insecurity, dread, fear. This underlying feeling just obstructs any real chance for genuine intimacy to develop.
If you don't feel safe, you can't really be vulnerable or trust someone.
Precisely. So the big takeaway here is that this fundamental lack of safety makes building a healthy, trusting bond incredibly difficult, maybe impossible in his view.
Which would mean, well, all the usual advice, like communicate better, set clear boundaries. Vaknin thinks that stuff just doesn't work here.
Largely, yes. That's a core part of his argument. He suggests those standard tools fail because they don't address the underlying instability and internal conflicts he identifies. The usual relationship playbook is ineffective in this context, according to him.
Okay, then there's this other concept he brings up, the dead mother dynamic. That sounds pretty dark.
It's a complex psychological idea for sure. He suggests the person with BPD might unconsciously play the role of an emotionally unavailable or dead mother figure.
How? Through what behaviors?
Through things like intermittent reinforcement being warm, then cold, and that approach avoidance pattern we just talked about. Unpredictability.
And why would someone do that? What's the payoff, psychologically speaking?
Vaknin proposes it might actually be a way for the person with BPD to manage their own abandonment anxiety. By keeping the partner constantly guessing and trying, they sort of guarantee that he will never leave her.
Ah, so it's a kind of maladaptive strategy to keep the partner hooked.
In a way, yes. And then he connects this to the partner's psychology, particularly if the partner has narcissistic traits.
Okay, how does that fit?
He suggests such a partner might have an unconscious drive to fix and cure and heal and rescue and save his dead mother. They're drawn to this dynamic because it allows them to play out this old pattern.
So it's like both people are unconsciously replaying roles from their past.
That's the idea. And the dead mother persona also serves another function. It keeps the partner at a distance, which might prevent the partner's own fears of engulfment. It's this intricate, interlocking system.
He calls it a perpetual dynamic, right? A constant interplay.
Yes, a perpetual mobility of narcissist borderline dynamics. He even says borderlines and narcissists are like mirror images of each other.
Leading to an inexorable attraction.
That's his term. He suggests narcissists might be drawn to the sheer intensity of emotions in borderlines, even the negative ones, and perhaps a perception that they're easier to manipulate.
So the connection isn't really about health or compatibility.
Not according to Vaknin. It's more about these complementary psychological needs fitting together, creating what he calls a shared fantasy, but one based on unhealthy patterns. The key insight, the attraction itself, might be rooted in pathology.
Okay, so given all of this, I mean, it sounds incredibly challenging. Does Vaknin see any path forward for these relationships?
Well, his general advice is pretty blunt.
Which is?
Overwhelmingly walk away. He advises avoiding contact, saying things like, if it's not your cup of tea, walk away. And if you can't handle the constant demands he describes, which he implies are immense, just walk away.
And he circles back to that idea about mental health restoration.
He does. He repeats that walking away from the borderline usually restores mental health. It's a very strong, consistent message. The main takeaway is definitely one of extreme caution.
And he mentions that this isn't just his isolated view, right? That communities often say similar things.
Yeah, he notes that online discussions often describe the experience as that devastating emotional car crash, and the advice you commonly see is just Leave. No, really, leave. Avoid BPD friends at all costs.
He also frames it in terms of cost, doesn't he? Like the personal toll.
Absolutely.
Hmm.
He calls these relationships demanding a very high and constant price. He compares it to a full-time maintenance job. And he adds, quite starkly, that most men would say the price is not worth the price. It sounds exhausting. The insight here, expect a massive ongoing personal cost.
But then there's the twist, his personal experience.
Right. This is where it gets very specific to him. He says, I'm one of the few who probably will think in the future that the price is well worth the price.
So he felt it was worth it despite the cost.
Yes. He acknowledges paying a very big personal price himself. But for him, the rewards outweighed it. He even calls a typical borderline woman a treasure. But, and this is crucial, only for those who can, and you're up to it.
So this is absolutely not general advice. It's his highly personal, maybe even unique take based on his own life.
Exactly. He's very clear this is subjective. It requires, as he implies, an extraordinary capacity for tolerance, resilience, or maybe even having complementary psychological issues yourself.
So his support, if you can call it that, is extremely conditional and narrow.
Very narrow. It's not an endorsement for most people. It seems tied to a very specific, perhaps pathological fit.
Okay, so if most people should walk away, who does stay, according to Vaknin?
Yeah.
What kind of person gets drawn in or remains?
He suggests it often comes down to the partner's own psychology. He talks about inverted narcissists.
What are those?
He describes them as a specific type of codependent, people who derive their sense of self-worth from the narcissist vicariously by proxy. Their identity is tied up in their partner.
And other reasons.
He also mentions conditioning, that some people have been conditioned by years of dysfunctional wrong upbringing to be with narcissists. They're essentially repeating familiar patterns, even unhealthy ones.
So past experiences shaping current choices.
Right. And from the BPD individual's perspective, they might be seeking that alpha, confident savior.
Yeah.
The perfect person who can absorb all their turmoil.
But Vaknin sees a potential issue with that savior role, too.
Yes, he points to the partner's grandiosity, this need to be the rescuer, the fixer, as potentially being part of their unhealthy pattern. It feeds their ego or sense of self.
So again, it comes back to this idea of complementary needs, but not necessarily healthy ones.
Exactly. A shared fantasy meeting unhealthy needs on both sides. The key takeaway seems to be that staying often involves the partner's own unresolved issues or specific psychological makeup.
Okay, so for someone who is in the situation and recognizes the issues, what's Vaknin's advice for getting out or recovering? It sounds like it starts with self-focus.
Absolutely. Self-preservation is paramount in his view. Again, the core advice is walking away to restore mental health. It's about disentanglement.
He uses that really strong language, like needing to amputate yourself away from the borderline. That sounds incredibly painful.
It implies a very deep, perhaps traumatic separation is needed because, in his view, the partner may have become merged and fused with the borderline's intense emotional world.
So the goal is reclaiming yourself.
Yes. He talks about needing to cleanse, extirpate the voices inside you which are not yours, especially the borderline partner's internalized voice, getting back to your own thoughts, your own feelings.
And it's not just about leaving, it's also about introspection for the partner.
Definitely. He pushes partners to examine their own role, to let go of the functions that cater to your own grandiosity as a savior or rescuer, to stop playing that part.
Recognize your own contribution to the dynamic.
Exactly. And crucially, to stop regulating her externally, stop trying to manage the BPD partner's emotions for them, and ultimately to give up on the shared fantasy they built together.
That sounds really hard.
He acknowledges it's difficult and painful, but he presents it as the necessary path for self-help and moving forward. The key advice is really about focusing inward on your own healing and separation.
What about things like boundaries and communication? We touched on this, but if someone is still interacting, maybe during the separation process.
Well, he reiterates that trying to set effective boundaries within the active relationship is basically impossible because of the core instability.
But boundaries are important after.
Yes, setting firm boundaries becomes crucial for the post-disentanglement phase, for protecting yourself during and after separation.
Okay, and communication.
It's tricky. Remember the paradox. Unconditional love pushes them away. Standard empathy might not work. He even references a Reddit user's suggestion for when things get really intense during splitting episodes.
What was the suggestion?
To strategically mirror her words and actions. Basically, reflecting back what's being said or done when meaningful conversation is out the window. Treating it almost like interacting with a distressed child where logic isn't the primary tool.
So typical empathetic connection attempts might actually make things worse.
They often can in this framework. Vaknin's perspective implies that effective interaction, if it happens at all, might need to be more detached, strategic, and always prioritize your own self-preservation over trying to fix things through connection. Standard communication rules may not apply.
Okay, so let's try to wrap this up. Vaknin's overall view on BPD romantic relationships. It's overwhelmingly negative, isn't it?
Highly cautionary, yes. He paints a picture of potentially destructive dynamics, of very high personal cost. And his strongest recommendation, by far, is avoidance and walking away.
Right. We talked about the contagious psychological impact, the immense emotional toll, and that core advice. Get out for your own mental health.
We also covered his very personal, very specific exception where he felt the price was worth it, but we have to stress how atypical he presents that as being, not a model for others.
Definitely not. And his advice for partners focuses squarely on self-preservation through disentanglement, separating physically and psychologically, and understanding their own role in the dynamic.
Yeah, looking at your own patterns, your own potential savior complex or grandiosity, and letting go of that shared fantasy.
So, considering Vaknin's really stark portrayal, it leaves us with a final thought, maybe for you, the listener. What fundamental misunderstandings might we generally have about intimacy, about relationships, especially when severe personality disorders are involved? Vaknin's perspective really challenges typical assumptions about love and connection.
It certainly makes you think about the limits of conventional relationship wisdom when dealing with these kinds of deep-seated psychological patterns.
Something to definitely mull over. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.